The most effective representatives of the Zionist lobby are reckoned to be the Westminster-based Labour Friends of Israel. To its members, it's just one of many lobby groups working to influence government policy.
It tries to put a balanced view about the Middle East. It will try to put a balance of putting Israel's point of view, and often it feels that there is a very unbalanced presentation going on. It may hold meetings of members, it holds meetings at party conferences, and it may seek to talk to ministers, but that is very much in the same way that other lobby groups operate.
Labour Friends of Israel is not a normal lobby group. It's very well funded, it's very well connected, it has as its titular officers the leader of the party, and as it does the other leaders of other parties in their own party lobby groups, it has far more access, far more resources than any other group. The Palestine Solidarity Campaign, by comparison, has almost nothing.
Under the leadership of successive prime ministers, Britain's relationship with Israel has gone through many stages. In 1956, then Prime Minister Anthony Eden joined forces with Israel and France against Egypt's nationalisation of the Suez Canal. But the world's new superpower, America, demanded a halt to the invasion and enforced a ceasefire. Britain would never again act alone. From now on, it would follow America's lead in foreign relations, and especially when they concerned Israel.
Different British prime ministers have largely been products of their own times. For example, Winston Churchill very much had grown up in the colonial era. He was not going to be somebody who was going to be persuaded by human rights arguments, for example. You then move on to Anthony Eden. Yet again, you see somebody who's trying to defend the British imperial interest, trying to keep the British Empire alive even. An impossible task, perhaps. Later on, you're really looking at the Cold War coming in as perhaps one of the major ingredients, and therefore our alliance with the United States became a bigger factor. Harold Wilson was perhaps one of the most pro-Israeli of prime ministers, and indeed the story goes that he enjoyed serving Jaffa orange juice to Arab ambassadors when they came to meet with him. Edward Heath certainly had a reputation as somebody who wanted warmer relations with the Arab world. And then you've got Margaret Thatcher, somebody who we all know had extremely close links with Ronald Reagan.
And Tony Blair, whose decade-long tenure as Prime Minister was characterised by a perceived slavish devotion to US foreign policy, continued that trend. This relationship was to have a direct bearing on the most inflammable tinderbox in the world today. July 2006, Israel bombed Lebanon in retaliation for cross-border rocket attacks by the militant organisation Hezbollah, and an incursion that cost the lives of 3 Israeli soldiers and the capture of another 2. Hundreds of Lebanese civilians were killed and thousands more made homeless. The crisis caught the international community off guard, but Tony Blair stood firm alongside George W. Bush in resisting calls for a ceasefire.
And the height of this was the disaster of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, which for a full month Tony Blair could do nothing to condemn, apparently, wouldn't call a ceasefire, and the war dragged on with the subsequent loss of life of the people of Lebanon. How Tony Blair then became the quartet's envoy in the region is really very, very puzzling indeed.
Britain's reluctance to criticise Israel's actions was brought into sharp focus on July the 30th, 2006, the morning after the so-called Qana massacre, when 34 civilians were killed in an Israeli air raid. While many commentators swiftly condemned the strike with its indiscriminate loss of life, British government members were far more circumspect. It seemed that the UK was determined to maintain a united front with the Americans, who insisted throughout that Israel was merely defending its territory.
It was quite obvious when Tony Blair came into power after a few months that the relationship with America was going to be strengthened, and if you have a strong relationship with America, that means you have a strong relationship with Israel.
Jenny Tong is a British Member of Parliament, formerly of the House of Commons, now a member of the House of Lords. She argues there was an alarming trend during the Blair years.
Israel breaks all international laws, it does not respect human rights, and it's the one country in the world that never gets any criticism for that at all. And all of the political parties are terribly afraid of saying that. Now, the only reason they're afraid, it seems to me, is that they're afraid of the lobby and the backlash that may occur. And certainly I've experienced that backlash to a degree after the remarks I made.
Tong's public comments about her empathy with suicide bombers and her claim that pro-Israeli lobbies have a grip on British politics resulted in her party, the Liberal Democrats, sacking her from her position in Parliament. But this, she says, only proved her point.
It amused me somewhat because I had said that the lobby existed and put pressure on politicians to shut up. And then they did the very thing I'd been saying that they do, just to try and shut me up.
While those intent on a longer political career tread more carefully.
From the beginning of New Labour, the message was sent out that if you're a member of the Labour Friends of Israel, that was the sort of right thing to do. It was the sort of organisation that you should be a member of. And a lot of senior figures joined the Labour Friends of Israel, who then subsequently got promotions, nowadays are in the cabinet.
And as a case in point, take the career of the former fundraiser for Labour Friends of Israel.
Lord Levy moved from being Blair's chief fundraiser to being his Middle East envoy. A man who procured for Blair a lot of funds, we don't know how much, and exactly from who, because it was in a blind trust. These are the sort of things we may never know. But he got him these funds, and his reward was to be Middle East envoy. It was an extraordinary appointment, really extraordinary, because how could the Arab world view this appointment as impartial? Here was a man who was a music impresario. What experience did he have on the international arena?
The role played by Michael Levy in fundraising for the Labour Party was the subject of 2 police investigations. Tony Blair himself was questioned by police, a first for a British Prime Minister. But it all came to nothing. Then, just as the police closed the case, another was opened. This time it was against David Abrahams, another member of Labour Friends of Israel. Abrahams had donated over $1 million to the Labour Party. Fearing accusations of a Jewish conspiracy, he'd done it through a pair of intermediaries. Yet regardless of David Abrahams' real motives for donating, it's seen as part of a trend of wealthy Zionist donors and an acquiescent Labour Party that rewards them. And this leads to a climate of fear.
Every time a minister gives an answer in Parliament, they always start the answer by saying the government recognises Israel's right to exist, whether or not the questioner has even put that subject. And so we start off by assuming that anyone asking a question about human rights or anything is automatically attacking the existence of Israel. They're not.
But a growing minority is aiming to draw a line between its identity and that of Israel.
The lobbies don't like anybody sort of challenging them, and particularly, when Jews challenge the Jewish lobby or challenge what Israel is doing simply because it is wrong, it's against human rights, and there are lots of Jews who feel that this is, they take up a cause. Jews have traditionally been, supporters of human rights.
Zionism defined itself as a Jewish state. It means that every Jew in the world is by default a potential Israeli citizen. Now, the crimes that are committed by Israel, by default, incriminate every Jew around the world. Now, I wouldn't agree the Jews should be implicated, because I know so many Jews that have nothing to do with it.
Transparency and accountability are the watchwords of any parliamentary system, the oldest included. The charge, though, is that Zionist lobby groups exert undue influence by exploiting weaknesses in the parliamentary system. Britain's unique involvement in the creation and history of Israel created their special relationship. At issue is not so much the right or wrong of that relationship as the degree of its openness. Mixing political interests with religious sentiments, Britain's role in the Middle East from Arthur Balfour to Tony Blair, has caused misery, displacement and suffering for millions of Palestinians.
Without British support, the emergence of the State of Israel would have been much more problematic, because the local balance of power favoured the Arabs, not the Jews. At the time of the Balfour Declaration, the Jews were less than 10% of the population. The British were not neutral in this conflict. That the Balfour Declaration, the thinking behind it, influenced Tony Blair when he was Prime Minister. And the Balfour Declaration was a betrayal, the greatest betrayal of the Palestinians, because Britain promised the land of the Palestinians to another people.